You're a Liberal candidate for the Senate.
Okay, much better. All right, so you ready to begin?
Ready to go.
Okay, so to begin with, I just wanted to confirm that you are the Liberal Party's nominee for the Senate position, and we can vote for you come September 14th.
You sure can.
Okay, excellent. So the Senate seat that you're going for has been labelled by a few people as possibly the more important or most important Senate seat, if not seat in total in the entire country. And just quickly, that's because the Liberals are expected and the Nationals are expected to take the House of Reps, and obviously the balance of power is currently in the Greens. Do you agree, and how confident are you that you will win come September 14th?
Well, I certainly agree that it's very important. Whether it's the most important in the country, I think that's up for other people to judge. Each of the Senate seats, there'll be a number of Senate battles right around the country which are important. Certainly, I think it's very important for Canberra to continue to have Liberal representation in the federal parliament. If the Senate seat were to change hands, of course, there wouldn't be any Liberal representation for the ACT in the federal parliament. And I don't think that'd be a good thing. I think there's a reasonable prospect of a change of government in September, and I think Canberrans would want to be represented in that government. They want to have a direct representative, and I'll certainly be going to the community and asking for their support. I'm not taking it for granted, but obviously we'll be working very, very hard to get the support of the community.
Okay, great. I'm glad that you mentioned Canberra representation. So you're currently on the ACT Legislative Assembly,
Yep.
but you're also a nominee for the Senate position.
Yep.
How do you think you're going to be better able to represent Canberra in the Senate seat as opposed to the Legislative Assembly?
Well, I think it's obviously a different sphere, and so I think the Assembly is very important. It's been a great honour to represent the community in the Assembly, and there's all sorts of very, very important local issues that I've enjoyed taking up. But obviously there's important issues on a national scale as well. And so the national government has a different role, whether that's in the management of the economy, which is so important from a national government, looking at how we keep the cost of living down through taxation and other policies, but a whole range of important policies across the board, how we relate to our region, how we look after families. These are very, very important issues around freedom of speech, which I think is a critical issue for the federal parliament to be looking at the moment. So I want to be a part of that. I want to represent my community in the federal parliament. I think that the 9 years I've served in the ACT Assembly has given me a good understanding of what it means to be a local representative, and what I would want to do is take the same sort of approach should I be elected to the Senate.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to pick one single policy that you think is the most important on a national scale and also on an ACT scale, so two different policies in total, what would you label?
Well, I don't think you can go past economic management for the most important national issue. I think that if you can't manage the economy and the budget well, then you can't achieve anything else. I think that John Howard put it well when he said that economic management is not an end in itself. Economic management is what allows you to look after all of the other important things that need to be looked after. So whether that's our education system, both in primary and secondary and higher education, whether that's in health, whether that's in infrastructure, managing the economy allows you to do those things. So it is the absolute starting point. It is the thing where I think there is a clear difference, a very clear difference between the Labor Party and the Coalition, and I think it's going to continue to be the most important issue on a national scale.
And on an ACT level, what would you label as the most important issue do you think that we face?
Well, I would say it's the same. Okay. I would say that if you can't manage the economy well and manage the budget well, that the ACT will suffer. And I think Canberrans are well aware that you need a stable government. You need a government that's capable of managing the budget and the economy, so that we can deliver those other outcomes. Education will continue to be critically important to the people of the ACT. I think if we look at what's going on with the recent education announcements, I don't think there's much in it for Canberra. I think that we've seen cuts to our university sector, and obviously that's a really important part of our economy here and a really important part of our community. But likewise, our primary and secondary schools are not seeing much out of this package that's been announced by the federal government.
So just on those budget cuts, so recently Labor announced that they're going to take away $2.3 billion from future funding, and the Liberals aren't going to block that. Do you think that should be blocked, or do you think you would change that were you to be elected come September?
Well, obviously that's a matter for Christopher Pyne as the Shadow Education Minister. I think that he hasn't 100% finalised the position of the coalition on that, and so I'll be interested to see what they do. I don't want to see the university sector savaged. I think that, I come out of the sector here in Canberra. I studied here at the ANU. It is a very, very important part of our nation. It's very important that we have a thriving tertiary sector. And notwithstanding these cuts, we will continue to. But obviously, if you cut into it too much, it does put at risk the sector. It makes it more difficult for students to get the kind of education they need. From an economic point of view, it's certainly very important that we're bringing in international students, that we remain competitive in our university sector. We have an excellent university sector here, as I say, not just the ANU, the University of Canberra, a number of other institutions here in Canberra. So obviously I think there's still some debate to go there. The whole package is still very much contested. It's unclear whether or not the states will come on board, and that will obviously affect what happens at a federal level as well.
Mm-hmm. And if the $2.3 billion cuts were to come through, how would you advocate? So just to clarify, you will be advocating against those within the Liberal Party?
Well, certainly my view is that I don't want to see savage cuts to the university sector. I understand that there are budgetary constraints. The Labor Party has thrown away a lot of money in recent years, and they're now trying to claw some of that back. And an incoming coalition government will, of course, have to find savings as well. So there's going to be no easy decisions, but I certainly don't want to see our university sector suffering.
And how do you plan, if that does happen, if those $2.3 billion continue to be cut, how would you plan to sort of counter against that, so make sure that the universities still thrive, I guess?
Look, I think there's a number of ways that we can do that. I think we need to continue to promote our universities within our region and more broadly, particularly in Asia. I think sometimes we've seen some bad press when it's come particularly in India in recent years in relation to students coming here. We want to see that students are treated well when they come here, international students. We want to see that Australia continues to be a wonderful place for them to study and potentially to come and settle. I think that one of the really unfortunate things we've seen in recent times has been the debate around 457 visas. I think that kind of language from our Prime Minister and other senior ministers sends a very negative message to our region. It sends a negative message to our trading partners. We should be seeking to attract the best and brightest to come here and study, and in many cases to come here and work and to settle where those opportunities arise. So I think that I would be certainly changing the rhetoric, but it's not just about the rhetoric. It's about actually having a plan that says we do want to see skilled migrants come here. We do want to see students coming here. I think that will underpin confidence in our university sector so they can invest and so they can be continuing to branch out into our region.
Just speaking of the rhetoric surrounding immigrants, just on refugees, you were one of the first people to come out and support Scott Morrison's comments on refugees. And today, or I think last night, there was an ad, I have it here, that was released by the Liberal Party on, I'm not sure if you can see it.
Yep.
By the Liberal Party mentioning asylum seekers and street crime in the same sentence. Do you think that's appropriate language to be surrounding refugees?
Well, I'm not seeing actually that in that ad. I think that in that ad, I'm seeing that crime is out of control in Western Sydney. Now, I don't live in Western Sydney, but there would be no doubt many people who would argue that there are serious crime issues in Western Sydney. The point they make is they can't control our borders, and that is true. Now, people will draw their own conclusions about that. What I would say is this. If we are to have a successful immigration program in our country, my family were immigrants. My uncle was the first Seselja to come to Australia in 1959, and he was a refugee. We need to have an orderly process. There's no doubt about that. And I think if you speak to most people who have come to Australia from other countries, they would agree that we need an orderly process, that it is not a situation where we can allow people smugglers to choose how and when people come to Australia. That is not acceptable to the vast bulk of Australians. It's not acceptable to me. But when we get those under control, that's when we have confidence in our immigration program. If you look at the rhetoric on 457 visas, I think that was a recognition, and a very cynical recognition from the Prime Minister, that she's lost control of that debate, and therefore confidence is being undermined. And she looked to exploit that by sounding tough on foreign workers. Now, I don't accept that as a reasonable approach. What I do think, though, is that we need an orderly program, that people shouldn't come here unlawfully, and then we should discourage them from doing that. I think that's sound policy, and I think that the vast bulk of Australians would agree.
So when we talk about rhetoric, do you support things like calling refugees illegal immigrants, or even sort of linking them to crime? Do you support that? And
well, I certainly don't support linking them to crime. I think that people who come here unlawfully are coming here unlawfully. So I think we need to be clear about that. I'm not into rhetoric, though, that is attacking refugees or asylum seekers. I think what we should be doing, though, is making it very clear that that is not the approach for coming to this country, that coming here without authorisation is not the way to go, that we have a process for resettlement, and that should be the approach we're taking. I've been on the record, and I've said this in the Assembly in the past, that sometimes I think the rhetoric across the board, and it happens on both sides of politics, is unhelpful. And that's true, I've mentioned in terms of 457 visas, but it's also true of refugees. We need to be clear about what our laws are and what is the right process, but that doesn't mean that we need to demonise asylum seekers in the process.
Okay, great. So another question, a policy that's very important to students in general and very popular amongst students in general is gay marriage. Mm-hmm. So your predecessor for the Senate candidacy famously crossed the floor when it came to the ACT marriage laws. Yep. Would you be willing to do the same? And if not, why not?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have crossed the floor in those circumstances, no. I'm on the record, I don't support gay marriage, and so I wouldn't support moves to implement gay marriage. Now, if I'm in the federal parliament, I'm clear on, my party's position is clear on that issue, and my personal position is clear on that issue, and I wouldn't be crossing the floor in order to legislate for gay marriage. I think it's also important that we recognise that regardless of what your views are on gay marriage, that it is a federal issue. It is an issue, I believe, that should be determined by the federal parliament. It shouldn't be legislated for in the states and territories when it's very clear in the Constitution that marriage exists as a power of the Commonwealth Government.
Why don't you support gay marriage?
Look, I think there's a number of reasons. I think fundamentally I do accept the view that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, we've supported in the past other measures that would get rid of inequality for other relationships, but in doing so, I don't believe that we equate all relationships with marriage. I believe that marriage has had a special place in our society. I believe it should continue to do that. And it's primarily in relation to its traditional role with the raising of children. That has been the traditional understanding of marriage. That's not in any way to suggest that other relationships don't have value. It's simply to say that marriage is different and marriage has been given special recognition.
So I guess my next question, if it's associated with raising children, do you support same-sex adoption?
Well, we certainly didn't in the Assembly when it was voted on some years ago.
Why not, if you mind me asking?
Sure. Well, the position that was taken by the Liberal Party at that time was that, in fact, in an ideal circumstance, a child should have a father and a mother. Now, we know that's not always possible, but when we're talking about adoption, which is done in only very limited circumstances, we should, to the maximum extent possible, be seeing to it that children, where possible, have a mother and a father.
What would you say to the statistics that show that children who grow up in same-sex marriages are quite often and more often much happier than children that grow up in with a mother and a father? Well,
I'm not familiar with those particular statistics that you're talking about. What I would say is that I think human experience has shown over millennia that a mother and a father are very important for children.
Okay. And so just going back to marriage, I guess, if you don't support same-sex marriage, would you support civil partnerships?
Well, I think it depends in what circumstance. There's all sorts of different ways of bringing them about. Now, what we've supported in the past was a relationship register, which had all of the legal rights for relationships outside of marriage that that attach to marriage effectively. And so that's been what I've supported in the past. In terms of what might come up in the future, that's something I'd consider on the merits based on my philosophy that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Okay, great. And so it's a slightly different question, something that has come up time and time again. Would you support a bullet train for Canberra or even up and down the East Coast?
Look, I think it's one of those things that is something all of us would, in theory, like to see. I think that if a federal government were to commit to, a fast train between Sydney and Canberra, I think most Canberrans would welcome it, and I would certainly welcome it. The real question we're going to have to ask ourselves as a nation is, can we afford it? I noted the work of the federal department that was released recently and the $114 billion that they quoted for that project, not just for Sydney to Canberra, but across the eastern seaboard. I think, as I say, it would be a wonderful thing if it is indeed achievable. I think probably still more work needs to be done, more detailed examination of how you could draw in some private sector investment. In the end, I think the choices that governments sometimes make it difficult to achieve these things. And, you could argue that spending too much in relation to the stimulus programs, when I think there was wasteful spending, far too much wasteful spending, makes it more difficult now for governments to commit to some of these nation-building projects such as fast rail. And I think, as I say, fast rail to me seems like a reasonable idea. It's something most of us would probably like to see. The real question as a nation is, can we afford it?
So speaking of government commitments, the coalition has said that they're going to cut jobs in the public sector. You've said it's 4,000 probably. The Greens differ. They say it's about 20,000. But regardless, it's a sizable amount. How do you see that impacting the ACT and the Canberra community?
Well, look, I've been on the record as expressing concerns about, public service job cuts, whether it's the current ones that are occurring under the Labor government or whether it's proposed cuts that might occur under a coalition government. I think the reality is that these are directly as a result of the mismanagement of the budget over many years. In the end, we're now seeing Labor offering voluntary redundancies across the public service, downsizing the public service because they have simply run out of money. And the Coalition has made it clear that their policy is that 12,000 public servants across Australia, so not just in the ACT, across Australia, there would be 12,000 less public servants, and that would be achieved through natural attrition. I'm not a big fan of that policy, I've made it clear, but that is the Coalition's policy. I think what's important about that is that it will be achieved through natural attrition. So those who have a job in the Commonwealth Public Service will know that they will continue to have that job, whether there's a change of government or if there is a change of government to a coalition government. I think we always need to protect Canberra wherever we can. The budgetary reality is that both major parties now are either cutting jobs in the Commonwealth Public Service or have promised to cut jobs. I think that is unfortunate for Canberra, but I will do all I can to make sure that that promise and that policy of no forced redundancies is adhered to.
So if you had your way, how many jobs would be lost in at the ACT?
Oh, look, as a Canberran, I'd love to see no jobs lost. I think that, I think all Canberrans would ideally like to not see, less jobs in Canberra. The reality is we're seeing it right now. It is a result, I think, of a lot of poor spending decisions, which are now coming home to roost. They have occurred under a Labor government. And I think if you look at how the Liberal government managed the economy when it was last in office, what we saw, particularly in the second half of the Howard government, was significant jobs growth in Canberra. We saw the economy growing. We saw the lowest unemployment we've ever seen. That was the result of solid economic management. And I think that when people are considering between the two parties, they will consider whether or not the Labor Party has managed the budget and the economy well, and what are the implications of that, or what are the implications of a party that has a proven track record of good economic management.
Okay, great. And lastly, just to do, I guess, with the Liberal leadership battle that you were a part of in the ACT, how do you unify a party after that, I guess?
Well, look, I think that as we have before, the Liberal Party goes through difficulties from time to time. All political parties do. And any political party that doesn't have vigorous debates and sometimes difficult debates probably doesn't have a genuinely democratic party. So there are different views in the party. There are different views over things like pre-selections. What we've had now is a very definitive result. It's been confirmed. So we've had now the party speaking twice on the Senate pre-selection. And I think the party will get on with the real job, which is of taking on the Labor Party and seeking to bring about a change of government.
Would you take that view on rigorous debates within a party to federal Labor and say that that was appropriate or as valid, I guess?
Well, I would expect they would, but I think there's a very different system there. You've got a factional system where often the unions tell people how to vote. We don't have that, and that's one of the challenges. One of the reasons it's more democratic is because you have a lot of individuals who are free thinking. They're not told how to vote by anyone. Sometimes that causes us issues, but I'd much prefer to be in a democratic party where people are genuinely free to express their views and have their vote, rather than a party where many people are told how to vote by their faction leaders or by union leaders, which I think is the contrast between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party.
Okay, great. Seselja, thank you so much for coming in.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Great.